Hi, and welcome to What's New with Lean Startup, your go-to source for the latest insights and practical strategies for transforming how your company builds new products and services. I'm Ben Hafele, CEO here at the Lean Startup Company, and in this series, we dive deep into the Lean Startup, exploring how to apply it effectively in today's dynamic business landscape. In each episode, we'll break down crucial concepts, share real-world examples, and provide actionable advice. So whether you're a product leader, a corporate innovator, or a technology executive, you'll find valuable takeaways in every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel for more expert insights. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below, and we'd love to hear from you and answer your questions.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of What's New with Lean Startup. My name is Jonathan Bertfield. I'm Senior Director at the Lean Startup Company.
And I'm Ben Hafele, CEO at the Lean Startup Company.
So today in this episode, we're going to dig into the topic of governance in the context of the Lean Startup Framework. For those of you who saw our first episode, we went through all 6 of the components of the Lean Startup, and we'll remind you of those. But today we're really digging into what is the role of leaders, how can they really deliver as much impact as possible in the context here. So if we see this is really the 4th bullet on this list. Who makes investment decisions and how, right? So this is operating across the entire life cycle of an initiative as it moves from kind of the earliest of the milestones through to scale and revenue, et cetera, right? So we're really thinking, how does that happen? How do we know that we're moving in the right direction? What role do the leaders have in supporting that and really making sure that the right initiatives move through and the initiatives that aren't going to be quite as successful, they get pulled out and we reassign resources. So let's dig into governance in the context of the Lean Startup Framework. So Ben, let's start. Let's just think about kind of an overall description. What do we think about the role of leaders in the Lean framework? How do they operate? How should they operate? What's your perspective just to kick us off?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. Just like anything else, the role of leadership is to hold teams accountable. But the type of activity that leaders are holding teams accountable to do is different when we're using Lean Startup versus other types of activity. So typically, and for example, when you and I were working at big companies and we were executives, our job was to hold teams accountable for kind of building the thing we'd already decided to build, right? So we decided to on Monday that we were going to build, product X, and how soon can we get that built? Give me some updates. Let me know if you're running into any problems. Holding teams accountable in that way for execution. And so what's different in the Lean Startup Framework is we're asking teams to be accountable for running build, measure, learn in order to make the right decision on what we should build in the first place. And so the type of accountability is different. We're still holding teams accountable, and that is the primary function, but it's just a different type of accountability.
Yeah, so holding our teams accountable in a slightly different way, right? So, I think about that from the perspective of we're asking teams to move at a different pace. We're asking them to think about not the ultimate goal, like on day one. We're saying, don't think about like revenue and long-term contribution to the P&L. Let's start by thinking about something else, right? So that's a shift in perspective, and that demands that when leaders are operating effectively in the context of Lean Startup, they're asking a different set of questions of the teams, right? They're slowing them down a little bit so they can go faster, and that means that the kinds of answers that leaders want to be hearing about are going to be different than they used to.
I like that, and I think it's a difficult balance, right? When we say, hey, don't worry about revenue, don't worry about return on investment initially. Sometimes that can seem inappropriate from leadership's perspective, because of course the reason we're here is to make revenue and to make profit. And so one of the things that we commonly come up against is leaders asking the question, hey, tell me what the return on investment on this is, but before we get started. And when we're dealing with uncertainty, like we are when we're applying Lean Startup, we might not know who the customer is yet, or if we have traction for our product, or if we have the right go-to-market strategy, or if we even have the right business model for that particular product. And so leaders are right in asking, hey, what's the return on investment? And the appropriate response from a team is, hey, we can give you an estimate right now, but we really don't know. If we follow these milestones, which is another component of the Lean Startup Framework, um, each time we achieve one of those milestones, we'll have a more precise estimate of what that return on investment is.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a challenge, right? When you say like, we're gonna hold off on thinking about return on investment, right? It's my one of really a similar experience for me was when I was working on a project, over a decade ago, and we were asked for P&L that looked out, 17 years into the future, literally 17 years, right? And it was like, okay, and this happened to be in the education space, and we were talking about it in the context of the people who we're able to speak to today to understand the dynamics of this business. Um, they're in like first grade right now, right? Because they're the ones who are going to be buying the product in like 17 years, and it's like, what's the value in that? What can we do with that? How much reliance could we put on that, right? So, not every leader is asking for a 17-year P&L, of course, right? But like the concept is the same. It's like, what do we know today that can help us understand those business dynamics?
I love that. It's a great example, the 17-year forecast. Um, and I think it just coming back to governance then, right? So when we're operating under conditions of relative certainty, maybe the 17-year forecast makes sense because we've got some historical data, we know what we're doing. But in the presence of uncertainty, the type of governance is different. So you can still hold teams accountable to say, hey, for one day, put the best spreadsheet you can together and let me know what the ROI is. Like how many zeros are behind the one, just in terms of order of magnitude. But any work beyond that is waste because we have to go through some of those earlier milestones to find out if there's a there before that spreadsheet really has any value. And so I think it's a great, it's a great example of what type of governance should you have. Well, it shouldn't start with a 17-year forecast. It should start with who's our customer, what's the traction, what's the go-to-market strategy. So asking the right questions at the right time, which is just so essential, that new type of governance when you're operating lean startup.
Right. And it's really interesting when we're trying to introduce lean startup into an organization, really building the framework. It's actually one of the hardest things to do is to drive change amongst leaders, right? Because they've been, rewarded and supported, and a lot of their early training was like, your job is to know the answers, right? Your job is to be the smartest person in the room, right? If you're going to be successful, you're going to make the right decisions based on your experience. And in what you mentioned a moment ago, right, when we're not dealing with high certainty, in fact, we're dealing with high uncertainty, right? Their historical knowledge, their market understanding, it's relevant, right? It's not like that goes out of the room. It's just getting those leaders to say, okay, I need to find a better balance between what I know to be true from the past with what the team are talking to me about and what the team are presenting, what we're learning about current market conditions and future market conditions.
Yeah, it's a great point. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. When it comes to governance, right, we've got a portfolio of teams or initiatives that are running, build, measure, learn to find out, to make pivot, persevere, park recommendations. Who should be governing that portfolio?
Yeah. No, it's super important to ask that question, right? Because we want to find this balance. Like there's a sweet spot in there, because we don't want to have people who are too junior to really make a decision, right? So we don't want to have a governance meeting and a group of people come to present, the product team come to present to the leaders who are in front of them. And those leaders then have to go to another meeting and to another meeting to enable a decision, right? So we want the people in the room capable of making a decision, and generally that's like assigning resources, assigning funding, the right people who are capable of making those decisions need to be consuming the evidence that teams are presenting and making that decision. And at the same time, we want to avoid a situation where we're reliant on, having the CEO of a large company be necessary in order to make a decision, right? Because it's just going to be either a really expensive meeting or it's going to be really hard to get that person in the room at the cadence that the teams are working at. So there's a sweet spot there. It's not always easy to find, and sometimes we have to operate with the wrong people until we find exactly who are the right people that should be there, right? So that sweet spot between seniority, authority, ownership of the P&L, and yet accessibility so that they can be part of the conversation. That's where we really need to be aiming for.
I like that. I think another thing I would add on to that is there is such a thing as you said, kind of going too far up in the organization. One of the things that's implicit in the Lean Startup Framework is that, like we showed in our inaugural episode, it's relatively funnel shaped, meaning you're going to put more things in the top of the funnel than come out the other side, because some things you're going to pivot and say, well, that's not on strategy, we're not going to do that. Some things you're going to park entirely. And so you're vetting, shaping, and de-risking this collection of initiatives to come up with what are the right ones that we really want to spend our money on. And so implicit in that is, if you get your CEO, for example, involved in all of the initiatives at the top of the funnel, you're necessarily wasting his or her time, because some of those things aren't going to make it through the funnel in the first place. And, why bring the top executives through, all the discussion and the governance to deal with things that aren't actually going to make it? So one of the tactics that, we've used in the past is keeping the C-suite aware and saying, hey, we're doing this. And if and when we find out there's a there for some of these initiatives, we'll come back and let you know about it. But we really don't want to waste your time. And that's a genuine thing. We don't want to drag them through the muck of all the details of us eventually saying, we're not going to do this at all.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the tactics that I've seen work really well, you talk about like make them aware, right? So how do we make them aware, right? How do we keep the CEO or other seniors in the mix while at the same time retaining the capacity for decisions to be made at the right kind of rhythm? And so one of the things that's worked really well has been essentially a two-tier governance, right? So we've got like a product level governance, and then we've got a portfolio level governance. And so at the product level, we've got senior people who own the P&L, who really understand the dynamics of the individual products, and they're making decisions, essentially those pivot, persevere, kill decisions. Should this particular product move forward? Should it get the funding it needs? Should it get the team assigned to it, etc.? Like versus, product A versus product B. We're making those decisions at the product level, and that's happening, often multiple times a month, right? In organizations that have large portfolios. In fact, I was at one of those meetings today, which was every week we're having 2 governance meetings, right? Because there's such a high volume of decisions to be made, right? And so every week we're having 2, and it builds up to, 3 or so projects per meeting, right? You can get through a lot of decisions over the course of a month, right? But again, like we obviously can't have the C-suite involved in that number of meetings. So what we have instead is a quarterly review where we're looking at the portfolio. So we're kind of elevating up out of the product level and looking at, strategic themes. We're looking at groups of products. We're able to make decisions about, are we on the right track to be able to deliver against our strategic goals? And sometimes that might be like, okay, we've got this particular product struggling. We're seeing some data. Let's pass the message to the group that is at the product level. This needs more investigation. but we're really able to direct the portfolio based on the kind of aggregation of the products in that portfolio rather than just focusing on individual ones, where we're going to have a large volume. It's going to be hard to manage.
Yeah. So I like this. I think we've covered the who. Now, who should be involved in governance? And I think that, you just mentioned even a two-tier system where there's people that need to be aware on maybe a quarterly basis and other people on a more frequent basis. Um, let's go to the how. So how does governance work? You've talked about meetings, but also we do a lot of work with dashboards and reports. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So um, there's a core principle around governance in the context of lean startup, and that core principle is evidence over conviction, right? So what we want to avoid is a situation where a really dynamic product leader is presenting. They've got amazing slides. They're really good at storytelling, right? And they're able to convince the leaders that their initiative has real traction, right? Just through the power of their presentation, right? And we want to avoid that, right? Because what we're saying is your opinion is nice, right? Your belief in this opportunity is great, right? We want you to be enthusiastic. We want to embrace that, right? Passion, powerful, right? But you got to bring some evidence, right? You got to bring some data to the conversation. If it's so heavily weighted on the conviction side, then we really can't track that initiative over time, and we can't compare it to other initiatives that are also in the portfolio. So we want to have a data set that is consistent across all the products. Like at a particular milestone, and we talked about milestones as being really critical for the overall structure of lean startup. We talked about that in our first episode, and we'll come back to that in an upcoming one, right, where we talk about what are the specific criteria that drive progression through the milestones. The details for this conversation, I think let's stay out of the details. The key principle is that there's consistency, right? So teams are presenting a consistent body of evidence to leadership for them to consume, right? So what that means is we're saying things like traction is demonstrated by the number of customers that we've engaged with. Traction is demonstrated by having an appropriate metric around customer acquisition, right? And so every team that is working on an initiative in that particular stage of the life cycle that's moving through the lean startup framework, every team is coming with the same data set. They're obviously going to have different numbers in there, but it gives the governance body the opportunity to really understand, okay, this is the kind of data set we should be seeing. These are the thresholds for success we should be observing in that data set. And so therefore that's putting the primacy on the data rather than just did the team who come make a really compelling story around their experience.
And the world is full of people that had high conviction that their idea was great, their new product idea was great, and then it crashed and burned. I mean, it was just last week. I was just doing a boot camp with a client, and I asked the question I always ask, which is, "Hey, has anyone here ever built a product nobody wanted?" And everybody started laughing. And I said, we talk about the pandemic, and everyone thinks that refers to that as COVID. There's another one which is especially large companies just routinely building things where there's high conviction that totally fail on the market. So they're building things nobody wants. It's a secret that everybody knows and nobody wants to talk about. And so effective governance is absolutely critical to making sure that doesn't happen by asking the right questions at the right time. So Jonathan, we've talked about who, we've talked about how in terms of, reports and dashboards and that kind of thing. Let's get into metrics. This is a little bit tied into milestones, as we talked about in the first episode. All these things aren't cleanly different from each other, but at the intersection of governance and milestones is metrics. So maybe just a couple of examples of metrics that you can hold teams accountable for when using Lean Startup, differentiated from typical ones, which are how fast did you get this done? Were you on time? Did you get it done, in the time allotted? And or we said we were going to build to this tech spec. Did you meet the tech spec? What are some examples of metrics that a governing body can apply to initiatives that are running through the Lean Startup Framework?
Yeah. So I'm going to connect it back to the how as well, right? Because we didn't get into actually in too much detail, like dashboards. So let's talk about how a metric that is really important shows up on a dashboard, right? Because again, one of the things that's hard for leaders, especially when you're dealing with a high volume of products, is keeping track of all of the different initiatives that you're looking at and what is the data points, right? So there's an organization I'm working with in the telecom space, and we built a dashboard that captures the key metrics that teams who are working on initiatives should be operating against. And so one of them that's really powerful, it's essentially their learning velocity and volume, right? So how many customers has the team interacted with over the last month, right? That gives a sense of, are they really embracing customer centricity? Are they really learning from their customers on a regular basis? Not just like a one-off, like early on, let's find out whether there's a problem, but like all the way through, right? And so the dashboard includes this number, and so it's reliant on the teams entering their data. How many customers did they engage with over the last month? And then in the governance conversation, there's a hard data point there for the teams to look at and present evidence, and for the leaders to look at and say, I'm going to make sure I pay attention to that learning velocity and volume that's happened over the last month, right? So we can see it in effect trains leaders, right? Because it's right in front of them, right? There's a dashboard with learning represented as a key criteria for traction, right? And so that's a big change. It's a big change for a lot of leaders to kind of keep their eyes on that change. And so by putting it in a dashboard, by putting it in something really concrete, we can embody the principles of, learn fast and really understand your customer, and do so in a data-driven way.
I love that. So if team A comes up to the governing body and says, "Hey, over the last 3 months, we've spoken with 42 customers, and we've run 7 experiments, and they get and then they say, and here's what we've learned, and here's how we know." Then team B gets up and says, "Yeah, we talked to one customer. It wasn't really an experiment. We just listened to them, and here's our recommendation." Team B should be listened to less than Team A because they have less evidence, and they might have more conviction than Team A, right? So Team B might be really convicted, but from the governing body's perspective, Team A's recommendation on what to do should be adhered to much more so than Team B, because Team A has actual evidence and customer-centric learnings, as opposed to Team B, who just believes in their product.
Yeah, that's right. And it's part of the cultural bias that emerges over time. And again, we're going to get to culture as one of the key elements of Lean Startup, but it's part of the way that we can actually build a cultural dynamic, because we're saying this is the metric that we're going to refer to consistently. It's not just something that shows up every now and again. It's something that's consistently there, right? So when we talk about traction for later stage initiatives, and we have a metric such as like organic growth, right? And so we're looking at how many shares of the experience were happening for a product, right? That's something that isn't necessarily directly related to revenue. It's not something that necessarily shows up in a P&L, right? But what it's doing is having a big impact on our customer acquisition costs, for example, right? It's telling us that, like, if we get one customer and they're, 10 out of the 100 are doing organic shares, that's going to bring down our overall costs. And so getting leaders to be able to view that data in a dashboard, that's a powerful way of driving the governance dynamics that we want to see happening when teams are presented, making their case.
It's a great point. So, Jonathan, what else should we talk about in terms of governance that you think maybe the audience would really benefit from?
So I think one of the big challenges is, I'll call it like status versus decision, right? So what can happen is that kind of project management is pushing for kind of a regular cadence of teams presenting their initiatives to leadership. Like, you are going to come and present every month, right? Um, and there's some advantage to that, right? The leadership keep in touch, they keep close contact with the initiatives, right? There's no kind of gap that emerges. But the big disadvantage really is that teams put a lot of time and energy into preparing a presentation around status, right? Which isn't necessarily adding any value, right? They're not coming to the leadership and saying, we've learned A, B, or C. We've got a decision point, whether that's about moving through a milestone or unblocking a challenge. And we need your help. We need your confirmation that we should get the resources. We need access to customers. We need a way to break through some of the pricing challenges that are being presented by procurement, other administrative parts of the organization. Right. So they're coming with a decision or a request for support. Right. So finding that right balance between how often the team is presenting and when they need to come with really critical questions, that's a big challenge that I see, especially for large organizations where there's a high volume of meetings and there's kind of a pretty intense culture around updates and keeping leaders aware. So finding that balance is really important.
And I think we alluded to this in the first episode, but also just you're also talking about the cadence. It's like, how often should you be reporting out to the governing body? And again, the governing body could be a panel. It could be just one person. It could be your supervisor, just depending on the situation. And so we've seen instances where the cadence is just too long. So there's not enough the distance between, okay, we need you to go and apply lean startup to this, and 6 months from now come and tell us what you found out. That's typically, there could be a case where that's appropriate, right? But that's typically too long because teams get lost in the woods and they're not really sure what to do, and they encounter issues and problems, or they make discoveries and they need to tell the governing body about it. And so, but there's also too frequent governance, and so we've had other other situations where it's there's so much governance that teams don't do the method of running, build, measure, learn. They aren't talking to customers. They're not running experiments because all they're doing is producing really, really great slides for the governing body. So there's a balance there.
Yeah, and I think what's important, right? So that balance, 100%, right? It's present all the way through, right? But it changes over time in terms of how regularly teams should be coming back and presenting, right? So really early on, the teams are going to learn a ton in a pretty short cycle, right? So like, as much as like every month they could be getting to a pivot decision, or they could be getting to a major challenge where they need support, right? Yeah, that's a lot of meetings to have with senior leadership, right? As they get more mature and the products are out there generating revenue in their first kind of validation of the overall business model and the go-to-market strategy, that could take 3, 4, 6 months for them to have something that is meaningful for leaders to weigh in on and to get support on, right? So again, the team that is going on that 6-month cadence, they're going to need to think really carefully about, do they wait the full amount of time? Do they send out some updates through other channels, right? Like, how are they keeping the leaders informed, even though they're not having a governance meeting to drive the conversation? So let me bring up another topic, because I think this is an important one in terms of the dynamic that leaders struggle with, right? Which is this balance of how they digest what the teams are presenting, right? So the ideal scenario is that teams are coming with a recommendation, right? This isn't a one-way channel. This is like, let's have a discussion about what we've learned. And so leaders are put in a situation where they're really having to do, we often refer to this as like a 3-ball juggle, right? Which is, a fun name for kind of a challenging problem, right? Which is, one ball they're juggling is, what are the team telling me right now? right? So they've spoken to customers, they've got some experiments running, they've got the product in the market, and they're learning certain things about how customers are using their product, right? So current evidence is being presented, right? Really important part of the conversation. There's another part, which is, what is our strategy, right? What did we as a leadership group, in combination with the rest of our business group, what did we declare as our strategic goals, right? So we're going to go after a certain market sector or geography, or we're going to kind of get to a certain level of revenue in particular areas. So strategic intent, right? That's front and center for the team. And that's front and center for the leaders, right? Because what that's saying is, it's possible that the team is coming back and presenting really compelling traction evidence about their product, but it's taking them off strategy, right? It's moving them away from what our overall goals want to be. So we're balancing those two things. And then the final ball that they're juggling, right, in this little party trick that they're doing is portfolio balance, right? Because they may have, quite a few initiatives, quite a few products in their portfolio that are going after the same thing, right? And we see that that they're all strategically aligned, right? And they may all have compelling evidence, right? But which one, because sometimes they can only afford to progress one initiative. They can only afford to support one out of the, 4 or 5 initiatives that are in play, right? So how do they understand what they're going to do? So sometimes that's like, let's pick the best out of these 4, right? Because they really present the strongest case relative to the other initiatives. And sometimes that means we're going to put on hold, we'll do a park decision for a particular one or more initiatives in our portfolio. Great idea, team. Great work that you've been doing, right? But we're a little bit over-indexed on that particular part of our portfolio. So we're gonna transfer you as a team to this other initiative, or we're gonna put that initiative on hold in some way. So they're juggling a lot of those inputs in order to make an appropriate decision for the business that they're running.
Yeah, great insights. And again, just coming back to, we've talked about how governance, what you just talked about, how that touches strategy and also how it touches culture. And so again, all of these 6 elements are kind of interwoven, right? And just to double down on the culture piece, if a team does really good work on using build, measure, learn, produces evidence and says, "Hey, I think we should keep going," and then the governing body says, "Hey, great work. We agree with your decision in isolation. However, we actually are going to reassign you to work on this other thing because we have a portfolio balancing issue that you just mentioned." That team needs to know without a shadow of a doubt that they did the right thing and that they're getting congratulated for doing the work that the governing body asked them to do. And they shouldn't feel any shame just because their initiative didn't stack up, relative to the other ones in the portfolio. They did the work that they were asked to do, and that should be reflected in their performance review.
Yeah. Yeah. And that comes down to like transparency, right? Like what we don't want to happen is a team goes to a governance review and there's that portfolio balance dynamic in play and leadership don't share that, right? It's like, oh, we're gonna hold back on really communicating, and the team goes, "Hang on a second, we did everything right. Like, what's going on here?" Right? So, transparency in the decision making is really valuable for learning for the teams and building those cultural dynamics that you just talked about, rather than it being, well, leaders know what the decision is and they made that decision and we're just in the dark and we just hope that we get it right next time, but we don't know what to do differently.
That's great. And I guess coming back to maybe and starting to wrap up on governance, we're trying to hold teams accountable for doing the activity we want them to do. So we're holding teams accountable for running, build, measure, learn to make the right recommendation on what to do next. And that's very different from the typical way that teams are held accountable in a more traditional environment where we just say, "Hey, go do this thing, build it on time, on budget, and on tech spec." And so we really want the teams to be rewarded for making the right decision. And you could have a high functioning team that grabs an initiative and they say, "Hey, we shouldn't do this." And they grab another initiative and they say, "Hey, this one only gets to milestone 2. We shouldn't do this one." and kind of keep making the right recommendation to park initiatives, that team should be given an A+ 100 or the equivalent on their performance review because they're doing precisely what the governing body has asked them to do.
Yeah, no, that's a powerful insight that the positive outcomes aren't necessarily leaders saying, go forward, team, and build the thing that you're excited about, right? Sometimes the best decision is the opposite of that, so that we can all look at the portfolio that's emerging and say, this is actually strategically aligned, it's delivering against our goals, right? So team, you're doing great. I love the way you phrase that in terms of supporting them at the structural level in terms of incentives and rewards by saying, that's the right behavior. Let's keep doing more of that. All right. This has been a really good conversation, Ben. Thanks for going back and forth with me on some of these topics. So what we've covered there, we've covered who needs to be in the conversation when we are running governance in the context of lean startup. Who are the individuals? At what level do they sit? We've talked about how they make decisions, so the different inputs that they're making, that they're consuming. And then we just talked about some of the challenges associated with kind of running that governance process effectively. Really interesting conversation. Thank you. We'd love to hear from you, the audience, as you're listening to this. What are your biggest challenges? What are some of the questions around governance? Add some of those questions to the comments and we'll follow up in upcoming episodes.
That wraps up another episode of What's New with Lean Startup. This series is brought to you by the Lean Startup Company, where we help companies transform how they build new products and businesses. You can find out more about us and how we serve our clients at www.leanstartup.co. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel for more expert insights. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below, and we'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you may have. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.